Afternoon and welcome. I'm Stephen Norper. I'm the Senior Director for Policy here, and it's wonderful to see so many of our familiar faces among our policy and corporate supporters, as well as a number of new visitors today. So we have a packed house for an extraordinary discussion that will cap off the year and will lean forward with some positive outlook on kickstarting negotiations. While we'll go through some of the complexity with Eminent scholar David Kang and with Ambassador Thomas Hubbard, we look forward to ending the year and picking up on the note that was left by President Moon Jae-in when he addressed the Korea Society Council on Foreign Relations and Asia Society earlier in the fall. Those of you who were with us on December 6th heard a rather sobering assessment from some friends of ours with the Brookings Institution and CSIS, and this is designed to extend that discussion and also provide some positive bent and look at opportunities for forward movement. Again, we would like to welcome all of you. We would especially like to welcome Nick Bratt, Phil Sherman, our board members, and the Deputy Consul General and his entire team of 15 from the Republic of Korea Consulate. They have had the very hard job in 2018 of convincing a lot of people, and it's been an extraordinary effort, and we here at the Korea Society are very admiring of all that they do in town to put out the good word on Korea. As an American independent nonprofit organization, we certainly benefit from partnerships and a lot of time shared in discussion to better understand where the Republic of Korea is going. To help us understand the complexity of the situation today, we do have David Kang, who is an eminent professor. He is the author of several books, including most recently this year, the re-release of Nuclear North Korea, a book that he wrote with Victor Cha, who's often on our stage. And that is as important now in 2018 as it was on its initial release in 2003. That's out through Columbia University Press, and we highly recommend it. David also is the director of the Korean Studies program out of USC, and they do a tremendous amount and really are one of the highlights in terms of Korean studies on the west coast of the United States. Of course, we have Ambassador Thomas Hubbard, familiar to many of you as the chairman of the Korea Society, senior director for Asia at McLarty Associates, longtime and distinguished career diplomat who served as our ambassador in both the Philippines and the Republic of Korea. And moderating our discussion today is our president, Thomas Byrne. Tom served with Moody's and has been president here since August of 2015. And we've introduced a number of new programs. Those of you who follow our policy, economics, and finance discussions know that we've had a heady steam, and that's really largely the result of Tom's guidance and leadership. So he will facilitate the discussion today. We thank you again. A very Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, and Happy New Year. Tom, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. Right, so we're all here to take another assessment of where we stand with the extraordinary developments of this past year, South Korea's engagement with North Korea and also the U.S.'s engagement with North Korea. This is really in follow-up to the speech that President Moon Jae-in made when he was here for the UN General Assembly in September. He made that as Stephen Norper said, at the Council on Foreign Relations, and this was an event that the Korea Society as well as the Asia Society, I see Danny Russell is here, co-hosted along with the Council on Foreign Relations. I'd like to repeat some of the points that President Moon made. Maybe this could prompt some reaction and discussion from you, David, and also from Tom Hubbard. So President Moon started off by noting, as we all recognize, that it was really a remarkable turn of events when Kim Jong-un gave his New Year's speech a year ago, because stepping back, if this were 2017, I think none of us could have imagined what would unfold this year. But President Moon went even further than calling it remarkable. He called it a miraculous development that's happening on the Korean Peninsula. And what he was referring to was that the establishment of a permanent peace regime on the Korean Peninsula through the complete denuclearization of North Korea. Now, he also said that he hoped that once a complete and verified denuclearization has taken place, then North Korea could focus on economic development, and that would mean north-south, some sort of economic program set up, maybe funding set up, but all this is preconditioned on denuclearization and verifiable denuclearization from North Korea. And he also said that for this denuclearization to take place, for North Korea to actually go ahead with this, and that the U.S. has to end the hostile state of relationship between North and South Korea has to end. He talked about security guarantees. He also talked about, President Moon also talked about the necessity for some sort of end of war declaration, a political declaration. At the same time, he stressed that all these remarkable changes that had taken place through September were achieved based on what he called the rock solid ROK-US alliance. And he went on to say, furthermore, that even after a peace treaty is signed, and even after reunification, the ROK-US alliance should remain in place in order to continue to uphold peace and stability in the Northeast Asian region. So with that as a primer, David, why don't you try to work that in, or just go ahead with your prepared statements,
well,
mentally prepared
I'll take
statements.
a minute or two and just give an overview, right? Is that?
Yeah.
I think that's fine. I also think it's funny that there was a reference to the Brookings CSIS thing. It was a little more skeptical. I was just in D.C. for a week of meetings with various officials across, and think tank. And as you probably know, the mood in the Beltway is extremely skeptical. Everybody's and they think that Moon is eager and perhaps too eager to change things. And one of the reasons that I'm on the West Coast and not in the Beltway is because I have a totally different perspective, right? I think this is the real question is this: is this the chance, a totally unprecedented opportunity where we can do something? Or is this just same old, and we know they're lying and they're trying to get something from us, et cetera, et cetera? The conventional wisdom is very much there's nothing really new here. It's just another ploy. It's another way in which they're trying to set up the United States or get away with something. But I tend to think that this is actually, in many ways, a historic opportunity that we'll get once in a generation. I think there was one in sort of the mid-'90s that we managed to fumble away. Everybody did. We have a new leader in South Korea. We have a leader in North Korea. And we have a president in the United States, all three of whom are willing to do things that none of their previous leaders have been able to even conceive of or consider. And does that mean we'll get there? I'm not sure whether we will or not. But this is an opportunity to take a step back from where we were. And I think all of us would prefer to be where we are this year in December as opposed to where we were last year in December. So in many ways, the question is, do we have a strategy for going forward? And I'll say I'm happy to expand on this if you want. I think Kim Jong-un has a very clear strategy, and he knows what he's doing. I'm happy to explain that. This is not something where he sort of woke up last January and said, okay, let's go to the Olympics. Who wants to go, right? I need a skier. 2 skiers. Who skis, right? They clearly knew what they were going to do. It was clearly long planned. Moon Jae-in has clearly spent 10 years thinking about what he would have done differently or what he would do differently if he were president. I think the real question is, does the United States have a strategy? I think some in our administration do. As we all know, it's not clear whether President Trump shares the way that many of the policy-making establishment wants to go. We found that just yesterday with Syria, right? I think the real question is, does the United States have a strategy for actually moving forward and taking this ball wherever it is today and moving it down the path a little bit farther? And I think we'll find out. But I think that's really the question is, how are we going to move forward? Because I think both sides of the Korean Peninsula are ready to try and move. And I think the question is, can the U.S. meet them in some manner?
Mm-hmm. Right. Tom, so is this an historic opportunity, an opportunity for a breakthrough perhaps, or the same old game?
Well, first, let me say that, David, we're very glad to have you here on the East Coast.
I should have said thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're glad to have you here on the East Coast because I think we do here on the East Coast need some bucking up. That the mood certainly has been very, very skeptical. And I'm glad to hear you because I'm inclined to agree that we have an opportunity now that we have not had in the past. With three unusual leaders, in Kim Jong-un, I think we have a continuation of the North Korean dictatorship, but we do seem to have in Kim Jong-un a leader who cares about the people. He does seem to be trying to do something that will uplift the Korean people, but I do think he still wants to have his nuclear weapons too. And the question is, can he be persuaded to give up those weapons in the interest of the betterment of his people? I think in Moon Jae-in we have a very different person too, someone who, as you say, has been thinking about this for a long time, has a strategy, had the courage to pick up on the initial moves that Kim Jong-un made to try to turn it into something, and finally we have President Trump in the midst of all of the skepticism, willing and kind of eager to take a chance and wanting to keep this going. So I think we probably have a better chance now than we have had in the past, but I think the chances of moving forward into the denuclearization of North Korea are still very slim, and it is certainly a long-term prospect. I think we were reminded today that Kim Jong-un isn't really lying. He's willing to have denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and the entire area, and part of that in his mind, as we saw in a statement put out by the government press this morning, that he does see, when he says denuclearization, he means full denuclearization, elimination of any U.S. nuclear threat to him on the Korean Peninsula or in the region, and that obviously is a step that is going to be very hard to do. And so I'm a little less optimistic this morning after reading that, now that he's been very explicit in what he means by this until now undefined denuclearization, and I'm really not sure where we pick up and go from here. But I do have the sense, despite all the skepticism in Washington, that at least until this morning, people were planning on another Trump-Kim Jong-un meeting in the early months of next year. It was also disappointing that Kim Jong-un hasn't managed to get to Seoul as he had promised to do this year. But again, I think we'll have another round of feeling each other out, and I do think we have a better chance now than we have in the past. And as you said, we certainly have to feel a lot better this December than we did last December, whereas we're now talking about talks, how we get back to talks instead of talking about the threat of war. The good news is that in more than a year there has been no North Korean testing of nuclear weapons or ballistic missiles. My question is how long can this last if we don't get back into some kind of process? And one of the disappointing things is up until now, the North Koreans have really been willing only to talk at the very top level, and it's going to be hard to get to productive discussions with that attitude.
Right. Yeah. So when I woke up, I read the same news that the North Korean Central News Agency said that defined what they meant by denuclearization, mean elimination of the threat from the U.S. and probably the nuclear umbrella in the alliance with the U.S., maybe with Japan too. But I wonder, is this really news? I mean, shouldn't this have been discussed at the Pompeo's visit or Moon's visit? I mean, is this really news? It's news to us, but is it news to the U.S. government and the South Korean government? Didn't they know when they entered into this process of engaging North Korea summit talks that this is North Korea's starting position? Is that a surprise, David? Yeah.
No, it's not a surprise. I don't think there's anything new in this stuff, right? Like,
Yeah.
One of the so our book, which makes a great Christmas gift, by the way, Mom will love it. We wrote literally 15 years ago, and the same issues are on the table then as they are today. So I don't think it's really a surprise. North Korea has always said this would not be a unilateral disarmament. What that means is, sort of maybe more specific today than it was yesterday, but nobody thought that North Korea, it was unrealistic to think that North Korea would simply, let a boat back up into Wonsan Harbor and they would just load up all the nukes and then say, okay, we're done with it, right? I mean, this is always going to be a mutual process. And the question from the American side was always, what will we do in response? What is going to be on the table from our side, which this administration has not made clear yet, what is on the table and what's not. And they might have done it again privately or something else, but certainly publicly, it's not clear. And the North Koreans have consistently said this will not be a one-way process. So what they said today isn't that surprising. The other small thing I'll say is it points out how unrealistic either of these goals is. We all know there is no possible way to verifiably, whatever it's called now, FFVD, fully, finally, completely verifiably denuclearize North Korea. They could let inspectors into every bedroom and look under every bed and in every closet, and we'll still think he's got some hidden. And they could always start over, right? It will never be perfect, complete and irreversible. They can always start over. Mm-hmm. And the same thing for the United States. There's no way that we can promise not to ever threaten North Korea, because of course we can. We're in the United States, right? A massive military. Of course we can always change our minds. So the question is, how do we get beyond the unrealistic to something that moves us from here and moves us in the right direction? And I think that's a much more realistic goal, is to move back a little bit as opposed to say, here's the end goal, and if we don't get there right away, I'm walking away.
Then what would be those steps?
I think we're seeing some of those steps right now, right? I mean, like some of the first steps, and again, one of the interesting things is like a year without missile and nuclear tests. That's huge. Why did we care? The missile and nuclear tests. I mean, I suspect, I'll make a prediction. If North Korea doesn't test anymore, I think the air for any kind of real pressure goes out of the balloon. I mean, I really think that's the provocations that we care about. And if they just sort of stop right now and stand still, it'll be very hard to get a lot of enthusiasm or momentum forward for any more coercive steps on the American side, right? So there's things they could do. They could do a little bit. They're already doing stuff for the conventional. And if you think about it, when was the most of the killing that went on in the last 50 years? It's conventional. It's Northern Limit Line. I mean, that's huge. Yeah. That stuff is, boats out there shooting each other up and 20 people died. That's massive. To actually make some progress on the Northern Limit Line in the Maritime or the DMZ. Which are steps back.
Right. But President Moon in his speech mentioned that it's significant that there has been no testing of either missiles or nuclear weapons, and that shows that some progress has been made. But couldn't you look at it from the other side? It's making a virtue out of necessity, because whenever North Korea did test, it faced ever-tightening sanctions. And there's one thing I think we do know is that North Korea doesn't like the sanctions. Okay, I mean, trade with China, visible trade has collapsed in 2018. There must be some economic pressure being felt in North Korea, right?
Yeah.
I don't know, virtue out of necessity, or is this really a significant step? Tom, what do you think about that?
I think it's significant. I mean, that is the biggest problem, the biggest concern. Sure, they have, the North Koreans said in stopping their testing that they didn't need to test anymore. They already had their deterrent. I don't think that's quite true. They do need to test to improve their capability. But I think it's symbolically very important that they stop. And indeed, I think you sort of pointed to a dilemma that in fact I think the North Koreans will soon realize that so long as they're not testing, they're not getting our attention and going back. In fact, one of their statements, I think even that statement this morning talked about the U.S. seemingly falling back into the Obama policy of strategic patience. At some point, they're going to knock on our door again, and I do think also that while we all knew what we thought we knew what the North Koreans meant by denuclearization, I'm not sure President Trump did, and certainly his public posture didn't suggest that in any way. So that now that the emperor has publicly declared that he has no clothes, we have to see where we go. I think it does complicate the circumstance.
Right. President Moon aspired to have a declaration to the end of the Korean War by the end of this year. Do you think we'll get it? And if we do, what are the implications, or are there any unintended bad consequences from something like this that would affect the alliance, or what's Tom? Why don't you start?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's not going to happen this year.
We still have 10 days.
Yeah, exactly, and frankly, it's something I think we ought to seriously think about. But the North Koreans have, over the course of the year, sort of rearrange their priorities. Originally, I think when President Moon was here, everybody thought, well, the first thing to do is declare the end of the war. And North Koreans at some point said, no, that's not really important. What we really want is to get rid of the sanctions. And that came out in today's statement too. So I think that particular issue has become a lesser priority as the year has gone on. Mm-hmm. But it is something that President Moon would like to have. I think this has been a blow to him, not getting the meeting in Seoul and not getting a declaration of the end of the war.
Mm-hmm. How important is a declaration to the end of the war?
I mean, we tend to view this stuff in two ways that tend to be a little contradictory, or just different ways. One is it's all symbolic, so it's meaningless. On the other hand, you can't do that. Well, if it's meaningless, then why? Who cares, right? You're giving them a victory. Well, I tend to think that the symbolism really matters, right? And I don't think it's the end all. Almost none. I mean, first of all, the thing to remember about almost all of this is negotiating. This is what countries do. This is what people do. Right? Setting out some lines. Maybe you mean it. Maybe you don't. I mean, that's why you engage in diplomacy in the first place, is to find out what they really care about, what they don't. I think the symbolism of trying to end the hostility between the two sides of the Korean on the Korean Peninsula is enormous. You can always build the guard posts. You can always, I mean, the images shown here of the two militaries shaking hands is incredible, right? That's very powerful, and I think that can really matter in terms of setting a tone by which you can try and have both sides try and take other steps. So I think that symbolism can really matter. At the same time, it's not going to, you can always remine and rebuild add more mines and et cetera, et cetera. So I think these are part of a larger package of trying to figure out, because here's the other thing, the nuclear weapons won't matter if we're not worried about the other country, if we're not worried about North Korea, right? We tend to put nukes first, but it's an entire relationship. And we tend to think we get rid of the nukes, then we'll worry about the rest of the relationship. In some ways, if you fix the rest of the relationship, then the nuclear weapons don't matter. There's a lot of countries that have nuclear weapons that we're not particularly worried about. Frankly, even China, for all of the headbutting that we're doing with China, we're not worried about a nuclear exchange with China because we know that's not going to happen. So, I mean, there's ways in which you can work on all of these different things without necessarily having to prioritize them.
Right. But I understood there's one thing different with North Korea. There's the risk of proliferation of the nuclear weapons that I think we're more concerned with North Korea than we are with, say, China, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Right.
But that would add urgency to getting denuclearization, right?
It would be nice to have. Go ahead.
No, I do think the proliferation issue is an important one, and it's particularly important in Northeast Asia because it is such a center of nuclear activity and sort of potential hostility. So certainly the implications for Japan, for South Korea are very, very strong if North Korea continues and permanently becomes a nuclear power. But then you get to the question of how do you stop that? How do you get there? And my own view on it is that with North Korea, we absolutely have to retain denuclearization as our goal. We have to keep trying to get there, even though it will take a very long time and a lot of negotiations to achieve it.
Right. David, you talked about Kim Jong-un has a strategy, that he actually is a rational leader, maybe one of the most rational leaders that we have, looking what's going on in the world. But President Moon's strategy, I understand, for engagement is first establish a peace regime, then develop a prosperous Korean peninsula, or at least raise the standard of living of North Korea, and then at some remote stage you get reunification, but not by absorption by South Korea, by a merger of sorts, a confederation and whatnot. Does Kim Jong-un share the same vision, or is his strategy more political than economic? Or, I mean, what's his long-term vision for the Korean Peninsula? What do you think it is?
I mean, my take on Kim Jong-un is it's clearly he's concerned about his survival, regime survival. So it's fundamentally a political strategy. And one of the reasons that I think it's different is he's a different leader in a different place than either his father or his grandfather. It's just the way the world works. He has a 40-year, whatever, assuming he lives that long, right? He's he'll rule till he's 70. He needs a strategy for 40 years. It's a different type of calculus that he has to make than if it's very short term. I mean, this is why I say I think he's got a strategy. This is not something where he's just worried about tomorrow. And if you think about it, what is the strategy that's going to allow him to survive? And this is why I think it's actually a very clear strategy, is if you go to 2017, January 1, his New Year's Day speech, this is the year that we are going to achieve our long desired goal. And you know what? All year they did. 60 tests, bam, 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 nuclear tests, long, short range, all the way into November, into December, right? Things we never thought they would do. They don't test in the winter. Oh, they did. We went berserk. Tests, sanctions, threats, indirect offers to talk, et cetera, right? January 1, 2018, we've achieved our desired goal. Let's talk. Right? Again, I don't think it was like December 29 that he woke up and said, let's do this. Clearly, they decided some back 2016, and I actually think there's a lot of other evidence that it's longer than that. And they probably said this as they're sitting around in their council of deliberations or whatever else, right? We've done a slow motion nuclearization for 20 years. Stop us before it happens. And they take a little step here, a little step there, and they haven't done it. Right? So in 2015 or so, they say, instead of doing, and we've gotten nowhere. We're still in the same place from their perspective, again, right? The Americans aren't meeting us, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. Instead of saying, stop us before we do it, let's march up the hill and see what they do. And then we can always march back down the hill. But if not, we can stop here, which is exactly what they did. Now they've got it, right? Again, it's not as good as they'd like, but they have a deliverable nuclear weapon. And they're at the top of the hill. And they say, okay, we'll be willing to walk back down the hill if you want, but it's a different strategy. And I can see why you would end up with that strategy. And the question they clearly asked themselves was, Americans are going to go berserk. Can we deal with the sanctions? And they clearly said yes. And here's our off-ramp. This is what we're going to do. Right? This is not at all clear when you're back in 2015 whether that's a better strategy than what they were currently doing. And so I think I can see a very clear strategy that has economic component and a military component, but it's about long-term regime survival.
Do you think Kim Jong-un was surprised by the ratcheting up of sanctions in 2016 by the UN and also by the U.S.? I
don't. A lot of people think he was surprised. I don't see how you could be surprised by that. Mm-hmm. They've already been sanctioned an extraordinary number of times, right? The idea that, well, this time they won't get worse. If we do stuff much worse, and they would say the Americans aren't going to ratchet up and make it worse, that to me, that's not realistic. Mm-hmm. They knew if they said, if it was a conscious strategy, we are going to test and we're going to do all this stuff and it's going to be paced out this way and we're going to nuclear test, ICBM tests, et cetera. Of course the Americans are going to go berserk. you have to say, well, probably they're going to respond.
But were they surprised that China signed on to all the sanctions in the UN?
I don't think so.
You don't think so, right?
And there's a lot of indication right now that China, superficially sort of went along, and now all the shelves are all full of stuff again on the border regions and everything, right? Like, we'll find out, but I think they have a strategy. So can we deal with it? And the answer is probably yes.
Right.
Not that it would be great, but could they deal with it?
Right.
Could I ask David a question here, a follow-up? Because, everything you outline is a strategy vis-a-vis the United States, and that could have been planned. Although, of course, they had no idea they were going to get the gift of Trump, which I think it was a gift.
I don't think anybody expected that. Yeah.
But they also could not expect the gift of Moon, that Park Geun-hye would have fallen the way she did, and he came on. So they've had to deal with some variables along the way.
And that's why I think it's even more was a deliberate strategy, because they couldn't have said, well, we're going to get a progressive president in. I mean, that you couldn't have predicted, right? I mean, so they decided on this strategy, even knowing that there was probably a more hardline government in the South and a typical American president, right? I mean, and that's why I think everyone is the thing that probably surprised everyone is how three leaders came together in this way. I mean, nobody could have predicted a Singapore summit.
Getting back to the strategy, though, it seems to me what you're saying that the long-term objective of the strategy is just regime survival, isn't it?
Fundamentally,
more than that.
I mean, there's more than that, but I mean that's the basic goal. But again, and I think what Kim Jong-un, the thing that we've always said, which is again, it's been a little bit. There's two sides to this coin, is that the North Korea can never reform, because once they open up their economy, everyone will leave, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a lot of evidence that a lot of authoritarian dictatorships reform their economies and become fabulously wealthy, like China, without the regime falling. I mean, it's not at all clear. Cuba hasn't fallen yet. And there's Vietnam, right? There's a lot of authoritarian governments. So, part of it is, well, they can never reform. On the other hand, if they don't change, they really are in trouble as they get poorer and poorer. And I think, again, there was a decision looking forward. It's never clear if that's the right decision. I mean, but you could make an argument for we can reform our economy, make people better off, and we can still retain power.
I think it's the authoritarian governments can reform, but is North Korea authoritarian or totalitarian? I mean, China didn't reform and it had a cult of personality under Mao. It had to make that big transition into a Deng Xiaoping-led government, not a cult of personality. But Tom, how do you see North Korea's long-term strategy? Can they achieve their regime survival without denuclearization and without economic development?
Well, I think Kim Jong-un's strategy is to try to do that. I think he continues to want to have his cake and eat it too, be able to continue to have his deterrent, and within that to develop. And I think that is the trick for all of us. I see a couple of other, Danny Russell, Bob Carlin's back there. We've been at this for 25 years. And for that entire 25 years, the premise has been that at some point, the North Koreans can be persuaded that their own security, their survival, et cetera, depends on abandoning nuclear weapons, opening up, et cetera. And it hasn't happened in those 25 years. And I don't think they've accepted that point yet. And that's the real challenge ahead.
Okay. And will there be a second summit with President Trump and Kim Jong-un? And if there is, what can we expect from it? Perhaps more than the June summit?
My sense from everything I hear in Washington, and is that we are counting on a second summit, that the president wants it, that we're likely to find some way to have it, and I do hope and expect that summit in Korea, South Korea somewhere, will happen early in the year too. I think we'll have another round, but we've got a lot to work through.
if we were a year ago, if we were sitting here on December 20th, I think we'd all be, and I asked you, where do you think we'll be a year from now? So we could imagine what our response would have been. But where do you think we'll be a year from now? Starting from today, December 20th, 2018.
Yeah, I mean, no one could have predicted a year ago that we'd be where we are today, right? So given that caveat,
is there a risk we'll be back to where we were?
I don't think it can get as bad. Simply as I said, I think so here's some of the things that I think have changed no matter what. I think one of the first things that's changed, and this again, I think is Kim Jong-un's strategy. I think what he tried to do early on in his rule, like 2012, 2013, is he tried to show the world that he was a normal guy. He did things that no North Korean leader ever did. Like, we saw his pretty wife, and he'd show his pictures, right? We never saw them before, right?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, exactly, right? Or sister, etc., right? We saw his wife. We saw him going to basketball games. And I understand that he didn't want Rodman. He wanted someone else first, right? But Rodman was the only one, right? But he was trying to show, I'm a normal guy.
He wanted Michael Jordan.
Is that?
Rodman said so.
Okay, right? Yeah, I mean, but the point was, I think he tried a lot of things that everything he did, we all laughed at and said, how strange.
Yeah.
But I think that was part of I'm a normal guy. I think the summits and the meetings, particularly for South Koreans, having him talking and seeing him on TV and hearing him speak, he's sort of relentlessly polite to Moon, who's like 20 years old. I mean, he's 30 years old or whatever. He's incredibly polite the way he speaks to him and stuff. Right? It's hard. The one thing that's changed, it's harder to sustain the crazy man thesis. I think that's gone, right? I mean, too many people have seen it, so they may not like what he's doing. But the idea that this is just some crazy man, I think it's gone, right? So we're in a different place we are today than we were, right? Could it go back as bad? It obviously could. But again, I think that as long as North Korea doesn't test, I think it'll be very hard to go back to where we were, no matter how long they drag their heels or drag it out.
So you would predict the status quo for another year, or will we make some sort of...
I think here's the other thing. I think Moon has a strategy, and I think Moon has a bunch of other smaller things that they want to do. The one thing that I've heard from people in the Moon administration was they thought what No Moo-hyun did wrong 10 years ago was too many big things and not enough small incremental things. And that's why they have the demining and the guard posts in the northern limit line. So there's some real progress that can be made even while you go for the home run. And I think there's still some more things there that they're trying to do. The rail line, they want a third survey. So I think South Korea has a strategy, and you could hear this from the talking points. Moon had two audiences, actually one audience went in the speech here. He's talking to Americans. U.S. ROK. It's it, right? Blah, blah, blah. He clearly wants the Americans on his side. He wants to let Americans know he's not going to sell out the Americans. And so he's got a strategy in place. So I think there'll be some small progress forward. And I think Trump wants the meeting, whether he gets it. It's
But
that for a non-prediction.
Tom, what's the risk of us falling back to where we were a year ago?
I think this next year will be one of ups and downs. Probably more dramatic ups and downs than we had this year. It was all kind of up from the low base last year, and I do think we're going to have to get back into more regular discussions. I think there's bound to be a lot of acrimony. I think we'll probably see still in this coming year more progress in North-South relations than in U.S.-DPRK relations, and that will bring with it challenges in maintaining our solidarity. We haven't said much. I do think it's significant that Biegun made such a big deal, our envoy made such a big deal of talking about alleviating some of the restrictions on travel and humanitarian assistance. It's a natural thing to do. It's something our humanitarian organizations want. It makes a lot of sense. Yeah. But he did, kind of offer it up as in a special statement as he was going to the ROK. And of course, we were met by this brick in the face by the North Koreans. So I don't know how that goes, but I think our side is looking for ways to keep this going and looking for ways. Began has made quite a big deal of this new working group we have. He's in Seoul right now as part of that, so I think this is going to be a year of hard work and a lot of ups and downs, and we have a lot going on in the United States that can affect our president's attitudes and the way and our approach to the whole thing.
Well, thank you all for the interesting discussion, and thank you, the two experts here, for sharing your knowledge and insights.
Good to see you, Dan.
Right. Yeah, we encourage you to fill out your form so that we can learn what you like and help us improve our programs. And we also would like to encourage you to join the Korea Society. It's a bargain. It's $75 a year, and your membership will help support activities like we had today. So thank you.
It was really nice talking.
Very nice.